Hello, today I am going to show you some different stitches that are used for hand sewing. There are many reasons why you may choose to hand sew. It could be because you don't have a sewing machine, or it could be that you're wanting to recreate things in a more historical way. Or if you're like me, you just like sitting in your chair more than sitting in a sewing machine. So I'm going to show some different stitches that will help keep your garment together and how to choose the right stitch for the garment that you're making or whichever project that you're doing. The basic things to start with hand sewing is, of course, you need needle and thread. Now, another thing that would help is to get some beeswax that you can pull the thread through, which will help keep it straight and help avoid some knots. There are many different threads that you can use. For my demonstrations tonight, I am using embroidery floss because it shows better on the camera. So with getting started, the basic thing to start off with is knotting your thread. I do prefer to tie a knot on my end, but I also will try to trap the tail in the stitches as well. I do both. So I'm not going to put my knot on the very end of my thread. I'm going to leave a little room, and I'm just tying an overhand knot and leaving a little bit of a tail. And I like to tie a couple knots because it's easy to pull through a single knot. And I just tie it directly over the first knot and do that again. I find that having the knot right there on the top of that cross when I'm making my little overhand loop helps me get it centered and be able to push it so that it goes on top of the first one. By having both the knot and a tail that we can trap in the stitches behind, that will help secure the end of your thread. Much like if you were using a sewing machine, you would backstitch over your first few stitches to lock your thread in place. So getting started, the very basic stitch is called a running stitch, where we just come up from the bottom of the fabric, pull the thread up, pull the needle down just a little bit in front of it. I am making my stitches larger than I would on most seams just so that they can be seen. And you pull it down, and that's your first stitch. And the next one, you would leave a little bit of space in between, about the same distance as your first stitch was, and you pull it back down. This is called a running stitch. This is not a very good stitch for making a piece of clothing, at least as your seam that's going to bear the brunt of the work, because it will come out very easily. Also, if you pulled it really tight, see how it's pulling through, but if my fabric wasn't in an embroidery hoop, it would cinch the fabric together and gather it. And so this is often used when you're making gatherings or doing large stitches like this is also referred to as a basting stitch, something that you just need to temporarily hold something in place before doing a different type of stitch. When you're looking at sewing a piece of clothing, you want a stitch that's called a locking stitch that will hold things in place. And so a simple way to do this, so we did one round of running stitch, is we're going to go back and do what's called a double running stitch. So I'm going to go up here, my last stitch that I made. I'm going to come up at the beginning of that stitch, and I'm going to fill in the spaces of the other running stitches. This gives 2 lines of stitching. This is also referred to as a cobbler stitch. It can be tricky to find the right place to come back up. But that's your double running stitch of going back through. And so you will have a line of stitching on the front and the back that will look the same. just like this. It's one side. And there's the other side. Now, another commonly used stitch that's really great for straight seams is the backstitch. Now, this is commonly used in embroidery, but it serves well its purpose well in regular sewing as well. This is the main one I do for sewing seams together. So we come up just like with the running stitch, and I'm going to go back down. And so far we're starting off like the running stitch, but this is where it's going to start to get different. So I'm putting my needle up about equal distance of my first stitch. But this time I'm going to go back and fill things in as I go. So this is I'm going back down where that first stitch ended. And this is a locking stitch it's not easy to pull it out, and it will hold things into place. So we're just going back. Now this will not look the same on the back as it does on the front. Pull up an example of that. Flip this over so we can see the back. Now I didn't try to trap in my thread, and also I ended up with big knots here, which is something you want to watch out for. But this is the back stitch. And you can see that it's a little bit different on the back than it is on the front. It's a good example of paying attention to how you're stitching things. So those are good stitches for doing a straight seam on even weave fabric, stitching on linen or cotton. They're good for that. And we have some other stitches that we want to look at. So the next one I'm going to show is called a chain stitch. Now this is often used in embroidery as well, but it does have its purpose in garment construction. And I will explain that in a moment after I demonstrate the stitch. So we pulled up the needle from the back. This is where it can get a little tricky. So I'm going to insert the needle just in front of where that stitch came up. And see, I went I went in and came up at the same time. I'm just pulling through a few threads, and I have a little loop. I want the long end of my thread to go underneath my needle. And I'm going to pull like that. It's going to form the first chain. So the next one, I'm positioning the thread so it goes over on the side here. I'm going to go into the middle of that first chain. And I'm going to pull up just a little bit like that and pull through, and makes the second chain. Show that again. We're just going into under a few threads and pulling it up a little bit and pulling it through the loop. So that makes a pretty decorative stitch, but it does have a practical purpose as well. On the back side, it's actually going to look like this on the other side, which is good to have that be what goes on the outside and this be on the inside. This is actually useful for any fabrics that have stretch, because there's a little bit of give with these chains. So if you're making an elastic casing, or you're sewing on fleece or gauzy fabric, it gives a little bit of give to it, so everything doesn't just pucker a lot, which will happen with a lot of elastic casings and things like that. So it is helpful there. So it's a really good stitch to use when you're sewing on fleece, which has a little bit of stretch to it. So those are the basic ones that I use for most seams. And then there's a few specialty stitches that we want to look at. And for that, I need to bring out some other fabric. I want to look at how to handle a hem. So I'm going to roll up my seam. I'm going to pin that. I'll show that here in just a moment. There are, of course, different ways to pin it. It's up to you what your preference are, whether you like to pin like that, or use clips. Many different options here of what you can use. So cut up my thread. So I'm going to show a stitch called a blind hem. This will end up having most of the stitch show on the inside and just a little dot that's going to peek through on the outside. Some people like to use a contrasting thread, so just to have that little line of the dots, and some like to use a thread that blends in with everything. So getting started. So I have my hem folded under, so my raw edge is trapped inside. I'm going to come up through just a little bit of the rolled over part. So then my tail is going to get trapped inside the stitches. I'm going to push that under there. Okay. So I'm going to go insert my needle just a little bit in front of where that folded over edge is. And I'm just going to pick up a couple threads from it. So it's on the big part of the fabric. And then I'm going to go through just a little bit of that folded over edge and pull it up. So you're just going through a little bit, a couple threads on the big part of the fabric, and then just a little bit of that folded over. And if I was using fabric that matched, or thread that matched, you wouldn't really see that thread very much. So on the other side, all you see is little dots. So that's your blind hem. That often would be used on the hem on the bottom of your garment or on the cuffs, sleeve cuffs. Those are some common places where you might use those. Now I'm going to show another stitch that can be helpful when you don't want a lot of things to be shown through. It's called an invisible stitch. So in this one, it's similar to the blind hem. I'm going to go, except for this time, I'm going to go parallel to that folded over edge. So I'm going through just a few stitches there, and then I'm going to grab a few stitches on the bottom and pull that up. Then I would go through a few stitches on my top. I'm going to show a different way to do it. I'm going to go through a few stitches on the top and pull up. And then on this bottom edge, I'm going to go through pull just a few of the threads on the fabric there. And then you go up to the top and go through a few threads. And then you go to the bottom edge You see, as you pull it, you don't really see the threads very well. Out here, it looks like the dot like you had with the blind hem, only it's going in a different direction. Now, if you were doing something where you had two edges folded together like this, like if you were making a strap or something, you can make it to where you don't actually really see the stitch. So I'm going to go on my top edge and go through a couple stitches or a couple pieces of threads of the fabric. And then on the bottom, I'm going to go through just a couple threads and pull that through. And then we go through the top again. And the bottom. So as you pull it, this is also called a ladder stitch or an invisible ladder stitch. So as you pull it, see that you don't really see, all right, you don't really see the stitches very well. This is good if you had, say had something like this, an edge, and you were wanting, like you made a strap or something, and you didn't want your stitches to show through on the outside, then you could use the invisible stitch. Because sometimes if you have a really narrow strap, stitching it on the inside and pulling it inside out can be very difficult. And this is actually an easier way to do it to save you some struggle and still not have the stitching show through on the outside. So those are our basics. We've gone through the running stitch, the double running stitch, back stitch, chain stitch, blind hem, and invisible stitch. Now the next thing that I said I wanted to show is how to do a buttonhole. So the first thing with a buttonhole is you, of course, want to mark your holes, but you need to make a hole. I am using an awl. There are many different sharp pointed awls and different types of awls that you can get. You can use scissors if you need to, but you don't really want to make it a triangular shape or to cut things because it will affect the shape of your buttonhole. So I'm going to use this to make a little bit of a hole. Now, sometimes you may need to cut it a little bit when we want to avoid it. I'm using the awl to work the fibers to make my hole a little bit bigger. Because cutting can cause more damage to the fabric. So we want to lessen how much we're damaging the fabric. And of course, we do have to have a hole. Okay, so we're going to get a new thread onto the needle. There are many different ways to make buttonholes and different styles of buttonhole stitches. I do suggest looking those up and practicing a few to see which works better for how you want things to look. What I'm making right now is more of an eyelet or lacing hole, which when we're doing medieval garment construction, often you'll use on bodices and sometimes on your cuffs for your legs or your arms and different things like that. If you're wanting to put an actual modern style buttonhole, the shape would be a little bit different. It's usually a little bit of a straight line, and there might be a little bit of a round hole on the end. And so there are different ways that you would do that. I do suggest looking up some different tutorials with that that'll show how to mark that. Because oftentimes you'll do the stitching and then you would cut it open after you've done the stitching. Sometimes. It just depends on what the purpose is. You could also get a metal eyelet and put that in and then do the buttonhole stitch over a metal eyelet. And that will help strengthen the holes. But you don't have to do that. Okay. Just threading a new needle here, a new thread. Okay. So to start, I am actually starting on the outside of my button of my hole. And then I'm going to go into the hole. There are different ways to do this. I'm going to come up right next to the first stitch that I did. And I'm going to take my thread and I just want to go through the loop of thread. I don't want to go through the fabric. This is the tricky part. And pull through there. Okay. And then I'm going to go back down into the hole. I'm going to go back up next to where my stitch started. I want to go through the loop. And back down through the hole. There are different ways to show this, and I'm going to do another demonstration of the stitch. A little bit different, say if I didn't have the hole, okay, so I have that loop. I want to go pull my thread through there. And what I'm doing is I'm pulling my needle in and then pulling it out like that. It's not going all the way through. And I have that little loop. I'm going to catch my needle and pull that through. There are different styles of doing this, and it's really hard to show this one on here. But essentially, you're trying to go around the loop or the hole, but making that extra little loop, it's going to give an extra little ridge and some stability to the inside of it. You can just go around the loop. Let's see, I'm back over on this one, around the hole. You can just go up through the hole and go around like this. You can just do that too to make your eyelet hole. So have to be careful to make it as uniform as you can. This is essentially what's called a whip stitch when you do that. example, if we were on the edge of our fabric, similar to the blind hem, if we just went all the way around like that, but leaving some space, that is a whip stitch. This is commonly used on edges and it leaves just that line on the outside. That's another way to do things. So I mentioned about choosing the right stitch for the fabric. So if you're using anything with any sort of stretch or give, a chain stitch is a good stitch for that. If you're using linen, cotton, anything that doesn't really have a lot of stretch to it, woven fabrics in general, then your double running stitch and your back stitch are good choices for there. Now, sometimes you'll have to look at the type of seam that you're doing to decide, would it be better to do an invisible stitch or a blind hem or a whip stitch? And it depends on the look that you're wanting. Sometimes it's a matter of how fast that you want to do it. And so that can make a difference there. The type of thread that you use and the needle you use also are factors as well with whatever fabric you're using, that sometimes it's trial and error. What's always good is to take a swatch of the fabric that you're using and practice a few stitches on it. See how it looks on the front and the back. Because something that can also make a difference on your choice of stitch is it easier for you to sew it with the good side facing you or with the back side facing you, depending on how your seam is. For example, is it going to be easier for you to sew this, say this is your back side of the fabric, to have it facing you, or is it going to be easier to sew from this side? Most of the time, you're going to want to sew from this side because that way you make sure that your seam is being caught. It's a lot harder to tell when you're sewing on the front of the fabric. And so in that case, if you're doing something like a hem and you chose backstitch, well, the messy side of the backstitch is what's going to show on the front side of your fabric. And that is not usually the look that you're going to want. And so in this case, blind hem would be a better choice for that. Now, if you're doing an inside seam, this is going to be the inside, then, use your back stitch. As for example, what I sometimes do is I'll take both sides of the fabric. Say this is my piece together seam. I would take the fabric and I roll it up like that. And this is what is going to be the inside of my garment. Then I would go ahead and do a back stitch on here because it's going to show this is going to be the inside and this is going to be the inside. So then when we were done, we would turn it out. And then this would be the outside. So your seam would be trapped on the inside. So you just want to think about the visibility and what type of look that you want to have. And with the chain stitch, you get a decent looking stitch on either side. As I said, the one side of the chain stitch will look like this, and then the other side will be the chains like this. I just find it easier that if you're doing anything that's going to have a drawstring or elastic and you're doing a casing, I like to put the chain on the inside because it gives that little bit of give when things are stretched. And so it doesn't have a bunch of uncomfortable puckers that sometimes happen if you try to do it with a different type of stitch. It'll be have a little bit more ease to it. So those are the basics, and that's all I have for tonight. Have a good day.